Howdy, Dennis Bradford here. Let's think some about being, feeling, and doing better. Is subject-predicate positionality more than linguistic? In English, as in many other languages, there's a built-in subject-predicate structure. Spot runs. The subject is the dog Spot, and the predicate describes the subject. If you learned in school how to diagram sentences, you already understand the structure. There's no debate about whether or not this is an important linguistic structure. There's also no debate about whether it affects our thinking. How could it not? That ball is red. I am tall. Like the ball, it's natural, at least for those whose native languages are like English in this respect, to think that I too am a subject. In fact, the most popular words are I, me, mine, and so on. Try going through normal conversations for just one day without using any of them. It's bizarrely difficult. Try writing even just a page without using them. That's also bizarrely difficult. At least after a few years or decades of using them, it seems inevitable to reify them. It's as if we think, since we use words like I frequently, there must be something they denote. What's that? Myself, my person. Then we also typically are influenced by the cause and effect positionality discussed in the previous video. That inner I becomes the cause of our doings. Our whole worldview becomes grounded upon that conception. Is there, though, such a self? Well, introspect. Do you find one? Hume famously couldn't. If you do, and I encourage you to try, what do you find? You'll certainly find myriad objects of consciousness. Some will be mental objects, such as sensations or pains or itches. Some will be perceptual objects like tables and trees and other people. What, though, is doing the being conscious of? It's not just that, in fact, we don't find a self when we introspect. It's also that we have no idea what it would be even like to find one. Selves are not only unobservable, but also unintelligible. In video number 96, the argument led to the conclusion that there is no inner person, no substrate or substratum. No nonsubstance ontology is adequate. You may, though, have a temptation to identify yourself as your mind. You may take your mind itself to be a particular. Is it? No. The noun mind comes from the verb to mind as it's used in sentences like, mind the baby while I'm gone, or mind that you don't bump your head when you go down the basement stairs, or did you mind that nobody asked you to dance? To mind something is to give attention, to be conscious or aware of it. In other words, mind is consciousness. As we've seen, consciousness is more like a universal quality than it is like a particular. It's an important mistake to reify it, to make it into a particular or individual thing. An episode of consciousness or mind is always about some other form, object, thing. It's always other-directed. Other-directedness is a quality of consciousness. Qualities are universals. See video number 80. Many philosophers divide qualities into monadic and relational. Monadic qualities are had by one particular. For example, this table is hard, or this paper is white. Relational qualities are had by two or more particulars. For example, the chair can be to the left of the sofa, or Betty can be between Alice and Charlie as they are sitting on the bus stop bench. If consciousness itself is a quality, or at least more like a quality than it's like a particular, is it monadic or relational? If it were monadic, what would have it? If we think that the table is hard and ask, what has the hardness? The answer is that it's the table that is hard. If we think that I am conscious and ask, what has the consciousness? The answer would be that I have it. What, though, does I refer to or denote? There is no person, no inner substratum, no self. So, despite appearances, saying that I am conscious is not like saying that the table is hard. Suppose there's an episode of perception. I see the table. Is the seeing or perceptual awareness a relational quality between me and the table? Not if there's no inner relatum. Therefore, the idea that consciousness is a relational quality should be rejected. If then consciousness is not a particular, and it's also not a relational quality, is it a monadic quality? If there are three options and we rule out two, guess what? The other directedness of consciousness is, again, following Meinung, called the intentionality of consciousness. As Panayot Butcheroff concludes, as G.E. Moore and Jean-Paul Sartre had in effect also concluded, quote, to take the intentionality of consciousness seriously is to recognize that consciousness is perfectly transparent, that it has no contents, that it exhausts itself in its object, that its being, though genuine, consists in the revelation of its object, end quote. From Skepticism About the External World. Sartre had argued that consciousness is inseparable from its object. Butcheroff agrees and completes the argument. Quote, consciousness indeed cannot be straightforwardly a relation, since it lacks one of the needed relata. But the relatum it lacks is the subject, the self, not the object. Consciousness can be only a monadic characteristic, though not a characteristic of the subject, but a characteristic of the object, unquote. So, is the table real? Are perceptual objects real? Is there an external world? As we've seen, video number 23, to be real, to exist, is to be multiply single-outable. In other words, something real is the subject of identity or two-in-one judgments. To make a judgment is to decide something. Primitive identity judgments are matters of decision. Primitive existential judgments are matters of decision. After we begin making primitive identity judgments and interact with other people, they guide us into making what is presumably an intersubjective conceptual hierarchy that we modify over time as we experience more and more. The world doesn't force us to make existential decisions one way or another, and we're not committed by previous applications of the concept of existence. In other words, we're free to continue to make judgments about reality, and there's no necessity that present or future judgments have to match past judgments. It's our innate ability to use the concepts of identity and reality that enables us to come to think about the world and to learn language. This is what philosophers would call conceptual irrealism, primarily with respect to identity. Phew! That's some serious thinking, isn't it? We need not here pursue it further, although it's not only a fascinating and important topic, but a fundamental one. My purpose in articulating it here is to make transparent my ultimate position. Why? It's relevant to our understanding of the nature of a self, ego, egoic mind. If it's correct, how do we develop an understanding of ourselves? If we take consciousness to be, or to be like, a monadic quality of the objects of consciousness, then the only conception we can have of ourselves is in terms of those objects. Therefore, a self is not like some object or entity in addition to all other objects or entities that constitute the world. Instead, a self is nothing other than that whole set. This is not a relativistic account, but it is an irrealistic one. Whereas most concepts, principles of classification, ultimately come from the objects of consciousness when we apprehend the world, the concepts of identity and reality do not. They correspond to no objects in the world. This irrealism, though, only extends to those two transcendental concepts. This is a Kantian understanding in the sense that it recognizes that we do contribute to our understanding of the world. Butcheroff concludes, quote, we are the source of the reality of our world, end quote. This doesn't mean that we create it, that we make all its objects. It means that we are responsible for its reality by our using of the concepts of identity and reality. What, on this view, is the self? It's, quote, nothing in itself. It is just a center of reference, end quote. This localization distinguishes it from being, which is not localized. In that way, localized consciousness is self, and non-localized consciousness is being, self. This is not a substantive view about the nature of the world. Rather than being an ontology itself, it's really a proto-ontological view. That means that it's a liberating view. If nothing else, it frees us from slavery to the view that we are selves, egos, souls, imprisoned by and inhabiting bodies. It's a mistake to think of ourselves as essentially being selves or bodies. Instead, again, we are being. Let's end emotional distress.